Hello. Simplex is the name, Eurospy is the game. Today's film has 3 different names, a very mixed up IMDb listing, a main character who spends most of his money just on bribing people, and an entire minute sequence of random characters dancing. It's Destino Estambul 68, or Agent Z55 Mission : or Occhio per Occhio Dente per Dente, a 1967 Italian Eurospy, directed by Miguel Iglesias. So, welcome back to Eurospy Cinema, a series where I review various movies that fit into the Eurospy category. The world is in turmoil. A group of counterfeiters have been spreading their money all around the world, and it's only just been uncovered. Meanwhile, a bunch of villains headed up by a guy called David Jones are quite angry that people have noticed their counterfeit notes. Apparently, the mistake on them was noticed by a young reporter by the name of Jeff Gordon, and David vows that his next forgeries will be perfect. Meanwhile, a man by the name of Sheldon, who worked with Jeff on the forgery identification, is kidnapped by the baddies. The baddies then go and kill off the man who had been making the forgeries through the use of a dart fired from this guy's cigarette holder. We then follow Jeff as he does some snooping around to find out what happened to Mr. Sheldon. The baddies don't like this, however, and stage Jeff's death through the use of a lot of whiskey and some cut breaks. However, Jeff's cunning means that he survives. He then heads off to Istanbul, not Constantinople, where he visits numerous nightclubs in the hopes of finding some small piece of information about the organization. Meanwhile, it turns out that the baddies have kidnapped Sheldon because he is an engravings expert. They want him to make some perfect forging plates for them. One of the women Jeff visits then attempts to drug him, fails, and then a fight ensues. Meanwhile, the professor has made the plates for the baddies, but with a minor imperfection on purpose. He then tries to escape, but Miriam, his secretary, betrays him and shows that she actually loved David Jones the whole time. Jeff, after a showdown with David Jones' henchman Drago, then meets Mike Harris of Interpol. Mike is posing as a part of the baddies' organization and is scared that Jeff is going to screw the whole thing up. But eventually they decide that perhaps it's just best that they work together. Meanwhile, Sheldon tries to escape with his daughter again, only to fail and to be killed in the process. The baddies then decide to torture Mary, which this weird professor guy, played by the prolific Victor Israel, does by making funny faces at her and showing her his rat collection. Jeff and Mike both show up now to attack the villa, along with a whole bunch of police and military personnel. Unfortunately, Mike is killed in the proceedings, and Jeff has a showdown with David Jones, killing him. The villa is then overrun with police, and Drago escapes, taking Mary with him. This culminates in a final showdown between Jeff and Drago, and after a very solid action sequence, Drago is dispatched of, and Jeff and Mary embrace. And that's the end of the film. The script for the film is overall quite fine. The plot itself is a very simple one, and there are some nice bits of tension and mystery created, specifically when they kidnap Sheldon, or when his secretary betrays him as well. The counterfeiting idea is definitely not unique, but it's not too bad, and definitely makes the film feel more grounded in reality than some of the more extravagant Eurospy plots. However, the first 20 minutes of the film are very slow. I don't think I would mind too much if it felt like the movie was actually moving somewhere, but the whole first section just feels directionless. This is definitely not helped by there being a full minute sequence of random unestablished characters dancing with no dialogue. However, as we are introduced to Jeff, it definitely picks up with a clear focus and direction as it goes forward. The first part of the film also has a very strong focus on torture sequences and displays of the baddies' power. At first, it is a little odd that there's so much focus on the antagonists before introducing the main character at all. However, this does to some degree contribute to establishing the villains as a ruthless enemy. It does feel like the film hammers the point a little too much, but it does very clearly establish to you the modus operandi of the baddies. However, a key problem with the story is the fact that it just feels like there's a lot of wasted screen time. A lot of scenes just seem to go for a little too long, such as the dance sequence and a number of the torture sequences. These scenes could easily have been cut down to half their runtime and still held the same weight as they do now. And what makes this all the stranger is that the film often has abrupt scene changes. It all just paints the picture of some incredible editing nightmare in the background of the film's production. Possibly the biggest example of poor editing is the scene where the baddies attempt to kill Gordon via a car crash. As soon as they send the car rolling, it all gets jumbled up. I can barely tell what's going on. but thankfully what happens to the car is not a major plot point, and having such a confusing sequence doesn't really affect the greater film. Continuing with that thought of camera work and editing, the film's camera work is overall quite simplistic for the most part, but it does have the occasional artistic flair. For instance, during one of the many torture sequences, when this man is suspended via a hook, it does a nice job of giving the audience the man's perspective, and lets them relate more to his terror and agony during this part. The film itself also has a very good title sequence. It's simple, but it uses a nice sort of kaleidoscope effect to transition between shots of different coloured negatives, which is quite unique. And to put simply, I am a bit of a sucker for these two-colour negative designs in title sequences and such. To add to this, there is a pretty solid song that plays over the titles, written by Franco Paisano. I don't know, somehow pretty well every Eurospy film I've watched has had a pretty great title song, no matter how poor the rest of the film may be. Besides the nice title theme, the film's score is pretty average. It never really stands out as either really amazing or really bad. It just simply exists and complements the scenes to an adequate degree. The only time the score is noticeably bad is during the many abrupt scene changes, as it'll suddenly chop to another track. However, this isn't really the fault of Mr. Paisano, and is instead more of a problem with the overall editing of the film. Giacomo Rossi Stewart, or Jack Stewart as was his stage name at the time, portrayed Jeff Gordon, our young reporter protagonist. And he does a pretty solid job. I do feel he is somewhat of a flat sort of cardboard cutout of a character though, as he really only wears his generic stoic expression for 90% of the film. However, something he does do very nicely is the stunts. There aren't a whole lot of stunts in the film, and most of them are pretty minor. However, when there is stunt work, he handles it well, and creates a nice air of believability around his character. It's interesting to note how many times Jeff bribes people for information or to get in somewhere. There are about 6 instances in the film where he has to do it. It becomes so frequent that it's almost some kind of running gag. I do find fault with this character though with how capable he is of spy work in comparison with his background. You see, Jeff is set up as a young, budding reporter who just so happens to get the counterfeiting scoop from Sheldon, which begins his career. However, soon after this, he's beating up baddies with the greatest of ease, scaling buildings, and generally just being very competent with his undercover work. It's a real inconsistency, and considering Jeff's backstory is only set up through a couple of lines of dialogue, could have easily been explained away. However, this problem I think isn't really enough to break his character for me, and for all intents and purposes he's basically James Bond Reporter Edition. Luis de Tejada was Professor Sheldon, and he is unfortunately not a terribly great performer. For the most part, quite like Jeff, I find his performance is very wooden. Perhaps if I was Italian I may find his dialogue to be more expressive, but going by his body language and facial expressions, to me, they just never seem to quite be fitted to the weighty situations he finds himself in. Nonetheless, Sheldon does have some good scenes, specifically those which involve his daughter, in which he does seem to get into character a little more. One key notable scene for him is when he dies. It almost feels as if the actor suddenly realised that his performance hadn't been so great earlier and so hammed it up a whole lot for this final scene. It's quite solid and I think salvages an otherwise fairly mediocre performance. Leah Nichols was Mary Sheldon, Professor Sheldon's daughter. She's quite good for the most part. Considering this was only her 3rd credited appearance in film, she does do a pretty good job, portraying a nice relationship between her and her father, and also sparking off the character of Jeff pretty well too. She is unfortunately kidnapped for a vast majority of the film, managing to be caught twice. However, when she is on screen, she acts well, and she also portrays being terrified to a nice degree as well. This of course is most clearly seen with the torture sequence with the rats, where she acts very well, even if the scene itself seems to run much longer than it has any right to. For the most part, she just suffers from not having much to do. The script seems fairly keen to sideline her, which is a shame considering she's probably one of the best actors of the film. Now we come to Giuliano Raffaelli, or Julian Rafferty as he's credited, who portrayed David Jones. Interestingly, in my research for this episode of Eurospy Cinema, I came across some exceptionally conflicting listings for this film online, and in some cast listings for the film, the character is called Division, which is certainly quite an interesting villain name. However, I have no idea whether this is his name in the original film. I don't think it is, as I'm pretty sure the actors say David Jones, and even the subtitles vary this by calling him David Jones. Anyway, for the sake of consistency, I think I'll stick to calling him David Jones for the rest of the review, despite how cool Division may sound. Now, on the topic of names, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the name David Jones, it's the name of a chain of department stores here in Australia. So there is an extra layer of humour added to the film for me, as I consider that after the downfall of his counterfeiting operation, David Jones decided to move to Australia and go into the department store business. Despite this, however, David Jones does have his menacing moments, most of which come near the end of the film. One of these is when he hits his men with a whip to get them to go and repel the police who are invading his villa. It may not be a particularly impressive sequence, but I do like the idea behind it, and it does show that some thought was put in to try to make this character somewhat interesting. Similarly, he also forces his goons to laugh at all of his jokes. However, it does somewhat fall flat, as instead of making David Jones seem villainous, it makes him feel more like a caricature. He just overall feels very lacking for the most part. And then, as the film nears its climax, it seems as if the filmmakers realised this and then suddenly decided to cram as much character development in as they could. It just overall doesn't land right. And this, for the most part, isn't really the fault of the actor, it's just that he got landed with a not particularly well-written role. Pietro Ceccarelli played Drago, David Jones's right-hand man and the main henchman of the film. Pietro does a really nice job with the character and gives him quite the menacing edge. Drago is definitely the highlight of the film for me, where David Jones feels only roughly defined and just generally lacks in the menacing character department. Drago certainly makes up for it. Pietro's imposing physique paired with the ruthless nature which he interacts with his associates pairs together to make Drago a threatening villain. He definitely couldn't have worked without David Jones being in the film, as he is very much a henchman and not a main villain. However, he is a very good henchman character who is very well portrayed. All throughout the climax, he is very intimidating and generally feels like the only person who could seriously challenge Jeff. An especially well done scene for Drago is when he kills Mike, the Interpol agent. It's such a quick and cold killing, something which just makes the character seem so merciless and dangerous. A similar effect is achieved later when a henchman suggests to Drago that they surrender to the police, and, without a word, Drago immediately shoots the henchman and yells at the others to get back to their posts. It's so cold, and really establishes Drago as a character who treats others' lives carelessly. A nice bit of character development that means that the audience is genuinely concerned for Jeff by the time Drago and him have their final showdown. Remo De Angelis was Mike Harris, Jeff's Interpol agent friend. Angelis does quite a nice job with the character. The main thing that really lets it down is the fact that the character is possibly one of the most tacked-on side characters that I've seen in a long time. The character appears first very early on in the film as a henchman who tells Jeff to stop his investigation, before the script then promptly forgets about him until one of the penultimate scenes, where he reveals to Jeff that he's actually working for Interpol, before being killed off by Drago only a couple of scenes later. I think perhaps I would find the character more compelling if I didn't feel like he was just introduced only to be killed off straight away. However, with the few moments that the actor has, Angelis does quite a nice job with the character, but he does overall feel like a clone of Jeff with only very minimal personality. Now, I would like to mention another henchman here, Ralph. Unfortunately, despite my intense searching, I have been unable to locate the name of the actor who plays him. However, his performance, much like that of Drago's, is so good that it's definitely worth a mention. Ralph, despite having a fairly pathetic sounding name, is probably the most sinister villain of the film. His main job throughout the movie is to show up and kill off any loose ends the villainous organisation has via poisonous darts fired from his cigarette holder, and the actor does this very well. Pairing very minimal dialogue with some pretty good camera work means that almost every scene Ralph appears in is suspenseful, as you wait for him to kill his target and wonder whether Jeff can reach them in time. Of course, Ralph has a number of opportunities where he has the perfect opportunity to kill Jeff instead, but honestly, to me, that doesn't really matter. Ralph is such a menace to his character that almost feels out of place in this film, so I can kind of forgive the odd and somewhat illogical script choices. The only major problem with the character is that he doesn't have a showdown with Jeff. I would have loved to have had some kind of closure to this character, but instead he just disappears about 3/4 of the way through, never to reappear. Now, moving away from actors, I don't normally get to talk about stunts and such because there isn't really much worth mentioning in most Eurospys I review. However, there is a mildly impressive stunt in this film, where Jeff climbs around the side of a building in an attempt to run away from the baddies. It's not perhaps the most impressive thing in the world, but it does add a nice flair of authenticity to the danger that Jeff finds himself in. In a similar vein to this, the film features some above-average fight sequences, specifically the fight with the construction tools, which, despite not being mind-blowing, does put a nice twist on the classic punch-up. Another good bit of fight work is the final punch-up between Drago and Gordon. Thanks to some solid choreography and a complete lack of music, the fight feels almost real, with serious stakes. The music is pretty great throughout the film, however I do really appreciate the choice to have this section be completely unscored, as it evokes ideas of one of the greatest cinematic fights of all time, that of the one between Red Grant and Bond in From Russia with Love. It overall is just a really nice conclusion to the film, and honestly, something that I was completely not expecting. I was for the most part thinking that it would be a quick, generic punch-up, but I was quite impressed with what the film does. Sticking with the theme of things that I quite liked, there's a great chase through Istanbul by Jeff and an unnamed henchman that is also very reminiscent of some future Bond films, specifically the chase through Egypt in The Spy Who Loved Me, and when Bond is running up all those steps in For Your Eyes Only. I don't exactly know why it is, but I quite like this chase, and as long as I ignore the slightly stupid moments of the goon hiding behind some object only to jump up and fully reveal himself again, I do really enjoy it. Overall, Destino Estambul 68, for the most part, is pretty meh. It definitely is not a Eurospy that you need to see, but it isn't all too bad. The film features a generic but easy to follow plot with a very two-dimensional main character and villain. There are some examples of very sloppy editing alongside a lot of wasted screen time. However, on the other hand, there is a pretty solid score, two very good henchman characters, that of Drago and Ralph, and the film also has some good moments of suspense and action. You really will have to make up your own mind on this one, as honestly I can't decide myself as to how much I really enjoyed it. If you are looking to watch the film, you can find it in a number of places on the internet for completely free, under the name of either Destino Estambul 68, Agent Z55 Mission Coleman, or Occhio per Occhio Dente per Dente. Anyway, that's all I have for this episode of Eurospy Cinema, so I'll see you later. Goodbye.